As my name is Clark Aboud, and I'm here to share my rebuttal to Dan Vogel in a recent discussion that I had with Bill O'Reilly on Mormon discussions. Point one is that Benjamin Johnson claims that Hiram married his sister Emma Johnson to Joseph Smith in April of 1843, and this does not work with the Journal of William Clayton, which says that Hiram accepts polygamy on May 26, 1843, rather than April. So let me go ahead and play his clip and then I'll share why this doesn't work.
Early June is where I suspect Elmira was sealed to Joseph Smith by Hiram Smith. Johnson, in his 1903 account, says a few days after the sealing, Joseph Smith visits Ramus and occupied the same room and bed with my sister that the month previous he had occupied with the daughter of the late Bishop Partridge. Because he doesn't have Clayton's journal, he only has the history of the church. He doesn't know when the Partridge sisters were there. Clayton gives us the information of when Partridge was there, and she was on that trip, the 16th and 17th of May. So in 1903, when he incidentally remembers the order, you might remember the order of things, but not necessarily
Makes
the
perfect
day.
sense. Yep.
He says, incidentally, that Joseph Smith came to Ramos a few days after the sealing. Then on the 13th of June, Joseph Smith leaves for Dixon, according to William Clayton's journal. So it had to occur before that. The early June sealing and then the visit in mid-June are my conjectures.
So as you just saw, Dan argues for a June date. He says that this happened when Joseph Smith got back from Ramus and before he leaves to Dixon with Emma and his family on June 13th. Now, we take a look at Joseph's whereabouts for the month of May and June after this visit to Ramus, and we can see that he only leaves Nauvoo 2 times. And the first time we have it is he goes to Carthage on May 25th, and he's back that same day. We also have him leaving on June 3rd to the 4th, and he goes by steamboat to Quincy, and he returns back. He's not in the path of Ramus for this visit. And this is in Clayton's journal. So for the rest of this, we have his whereabouts the entire time, placing him in Nauvoo. So Joseph Smith does not go to Ramus in June. So what about the month of July, Dan may ask? Well, we have Joseph Smith's whereabouts for the majority of that month. We see that he is in Nauvoo, and the only 4 days that we don't have him accounted for is July 24th to the 25th and July 28th to the 29th. But we have Willard Richards writing a letter to Brigham Young for like a week or two, talking about what happens on each day. And Richards in this letter does not make any mention of Joseph Smith leaving Nauvoo. So we could place Joseph Smith in Nauvoo for this month. So Dan may say, okay, so June, July doesn't work. What about August and September? Well, for August and September, we have a few days where Joseph isn't mentioned, but we have no single mention from anyone in any journal, any letter, anything saying Joseph Smith left the city of Nauvoo, let alone go to Ramus. We have Joseph specifically in Nauvoo the entire month of August, the entire month of September, and the only other time where we have Joseph Smith leaving is when he goes on October 11th to a mound, and Benjamin Johnson comes to Nauvoo to visit Joseph and Hiram on the 11th of October. So only time when Joseph could have gone back to Ramus that we have any account for is in October, which is what the history of the church says. You may ask, well, can't this whole thing with his sister happen later on? Like in October of 1843. Well, there's a problem with that, and that's D&C 131. Now, Benjamin Johnson says that after Joseph married his sister, that Joseph gave this revelation to him and later on sealed Johnson to his wife for eternity. Now, D&C 131 does have polygamous aspects to it, and the background of D&C 131 is that Benjamin Johnson was introduced to polygamy by Joseph Smith when he asked him if he could marry his sister. So if we push the date for Amara Johnson back to October, we have a problem with the authenticity of D&C 131. So let's go ahead and look at Dan's second argument against my argument for Benjamin Johnson and his sister.
Everyone should understand that Clark is accusing Johnson of lying based on the entry in Clayton's journal that says Hiram received the doctrine of priesthood on the 26th of May, 1843, which he has just argued can't be trusted. If Clark doesn't believe Hiram wasn't ever a polygamist, why is he using this passage in Clayton's journal to accuse Benjamin and Elmira of lying? Here's how historians look at this situation. If we understand Clayton's entry correctly, if Hiram received the doctrine of polygamy on the 26th of May, 1843, that is, if Clayton's entry didn't simply refer to his learning about Hiram's belief, or if Hiram had not vacillated like Emma, or if we discount Brigham Young's account that he convinced Hiram that polygamy was a correct doctrine in a private conversation in 1842, then Clayton's date is fixed and takes priority over any reminiscent account. Yeah, well, so the Clayton entry for the 26th of May is the setting is a meeting that Clayton is involved with. And Hiram announces, I guess, that he accepts polygamy. And that's when Clayton writes it down. That doesn't necessarily mean Hiram accepted it right there on the 26th of May at that meeting. I mean, that's not reasonable to believe.
It seems in my mind, knowing enough about the history of the church, that Joseph Smith would have trusted his brother far before he trusted Brigham Young with sort of secret information that could damage people. And I sort of struggle to sense that Hiram is completely out of the loop until a much later moment in time. And it seems much more reasonable that the moment Joseph is convinced in his own head that he's going to try to convince the church that polygamy is from God and it needs to be part of the church system, that Hiram would be one of the first people from that point forward brought into the circle.
So I'm not so sure about that, given Hiram's resistance. Hiram seems to accept that polygamy could be practiced in the eternities. And he seems there was like a stepping stone to his full acceptance of polygamy. And the stepping stone argument that Joseph Smith could leverage was, you know how your first wife died. And so Joseph Smith introduces the concept of eternal marriage, that marriage is valid after death, and that he could be married to his first wife the same as you're baptized for the dead. So if you accept it in the next life, why do you resist it in this life?
So in Dan's response, we see his criticism of me using William Clayton's journal for establishing a timeline, saying that I don't believe it to be contemporaneous. Well, I don't. This journal is what we have available to establish a timeline. And Dan mentions that this would be more reliable than reminiscent accounts. So this is the best we have to work with. In Dan's response, he mentions that, well, Hiram accepted it earlier than what he mentioned to others. Hiram could have accepted polygamy by first accepting eternal marriage. And once he accepted the idea of eternal marriage, then polygamy would follow that. So let's take a look at what Hiram himself said on April 8th of 1844 and his acceptance of eternal marriage. When did he accept eternal marriage? What were the signs of that?
I will tell you the truth with regard to the situation. God Almighty has given to us by revelation a plan of salvation, redemption, and deliverance, and the power and authority of the holy priesthood. Under the constitution of the Almighty God, everything rightfully and lawfully belongs to man. And if a thing belongs to me legally, it cannot belong to anyone else. I married me a wife, and I was the only one who had any right to her, and she the only woman with any right to me, until we had 5 children. That the covenant was made for our lives, and she fell in the grave before God showed us his authority. God has shown me that the covenant is dead, and had no more force. Neither could I have her in the resurrection, but we should be as the angels. I loved my wife, and so it troubled me. Brother Joseph said, "You can be sealed to her, upon the same principle as you can be baptized for the dead." I inquired, "What can I do for my second wife?" He replied, "You can make the covenant with her for eternity, and be sealed to her." And she said, "I will act as proxy for the one that is dead, and I will be sealed to you for her for eternity. Now if there is any man that has no sense, and will make a spiritual wife's story of such a fact, his name shall be published, because the truth of God can be transformed into a lie by the ignorant and deceitful."
So, according to Hiram's own words, Hiram said that upon learning about the revelation of eternal marriage or eternal monogamy here, he was sealed to his deceased wife by proxy, and we have a date for when that would have occurred. That's May 29th, 1843. For we have this recorded in Joseph's journal by Willa Richards and attested by Mercy Thompson, which the church acknowledges. So this happened the day after Joseph and Emma were said to be sealed for eternity on May 28th, 1843. So Dan's argument that Hiram accepted polygamy before May 26th is thrown out the window, as Hiram does not get sealed to his deceased wife by proxy until the May 29th, 1843. Now, I want to ask you guys what you think is more logical. My position that Joseph received a revelation on eternal monogamy in heaven on or near May 26, 1843, and within days of sharing that, Emma became Joseph's eternal spouse in heaven, and Hiram makes his deceased wife his eternal spouse in heaven by proxy. The revelation is misunderstood, and Brigham and others created polygamy revelation, D&C 132, to credit to Joseph for their selfish gain. And I'll show more about 132 in just a second. Or the position of the church. Emma Smith, a woman said to be possessive and controlling, allowed the Partridge sisters on May 11, 1843, to be sealed to Joseph for eternity, while she is still for time only until the 28th of May. Hiram, who is Joseph's brother, doesn't know about his polygamy until years after Brigham and others know about it. So Bill Reel makes a good point when he says, I have a hard time believing that Hiram doesn't know about Joseph being a polygamist until years after the fact. What do you think is more logical? Now that I've shown you that Benjamin Johnson is in fact lying and not misremembering, it's important to note that Louisa Beeman is said to be a witness at this sealing. And the reason this is important is that Louisa Beeman is the first woman that is said to be a plural wife of Joseph Smith that is attested for under the court of law, under oath by a brother-in-law named Joseph Nobles. The fact that Benjamin is lying and that Louisa Beeman could not be there but serious question into the very foundation that Joseph practiced plural marriage in Nauvoo, as Louisa Beeman is the first woman in Nauvoo that is said to be a plural wife of Joseph. So I'll leave it at that and move on to the next point. For point 2, I argued against Joseph Smith being the author of the polygamy revelation known as Doctrine and Covenants 132. And in the Kingsbury document, we have the word destroyed spelled 5 times correctly in a row from pages 1 to 7. And then it's misspelled 6 times in a row from pages 7 to 8. Now, it's not Clayton who's doing the misspelling, because in Clayton's journal, we have him spelling the word correct and never misspelling it the way that it is misspelled in the Kingsbury document. And I argue that Kingsbury wouldn't be spelling it 5 times correctly and then misspell it 6 times towards the end. So I argued that there were 2 scribes to 132, which goes against that Joseph Smith is dictating it to Clayton and Clayton is writing it down himself. So let me go ahead and play a Dan's response to this, and then I'll share my rebuttal.
Fine. Now, I will tell you, this was one of the most interesting slides to me because I can totally understand why Clark's logic and my agreement with that logic worked this way, that the word destroyed is spelled correctly in a grouping on the front end and incorrectly as a grouping on the back end. And I think I presented a way in which I could make that work in favor of Joseph Smith still being the originator of polygamy. But his explanation on this issue alone seemed to make more logical sense to me. And so I'm interested to see what you have to say about slide number 35.
Okay, well, I agree that this does look like there's 2 original scribes. Somebody wrote after Clayton, 11 and a half verses extra. But it doesn't mean that there's 2 copyists, because the copy, Kingsbury's copy, is just in his handwriting. He copied it. He said it was Clayton's handwriting. But yeah, the major part of it would be Clayton's handwriting, but he copied a document probably that had 2 scribes writing. Nothing unusual about this, as I'll explain.
Can you explain that differently? Can you say that? So help me understand sort of how the spelling differences would come in if Kingsbury is making a copy of Clayton's document.
Kingsbury's not a good speller, and he would have a habit of just copying the scribe who was before him. because he probably wouldn't recognize the shift in spelling, that it was a wrong spelling. He wouldn't correct spelling. Some scribes would copy something and correct the spelling. Somebody that was a bad speller probably would just copy what somebody else is writing. So that's why I say we know Kingsbury is the only handwriting in the copy. So there's only one copyist. Years later, he remembered, oh yeah, it was Clayton that wrote it. Well, most of it was. And he probably didn't recognize in his memory that there was more than one scribe. He just probably remembered Clayton's contribution.
So you're offering two possibilities, if I hear you right. One is that Kingsbury remembers incorrectly, and Clayton is responsible for the majority of D&C 132, but that there actually is a second scribe writing the original document for the last 11 verses. That's one possibility.
I think that's the very rational conclusion when there's such a change and they're all bunched together like this.
Yeah.
And I checked Clayton. I don't have the ability to check his whole journal, of course, but I checked various letters and things, and I couldn't find Clayton misspelling destroyed. And I noticed also that he was he didn't spell all the time correctly, but a great majority of the time he was a consistent speller. There's some scribes can spell the same word several different ways.
Yeah.
That happens quite a lot in 19th century documents.
Yeah.
But I don't see Clayton having that habit. So I would say it's less likely that he would change for the last 11 and a half verses.
It seems like the second possibility, which you spoke sort of to, is that Kingsbury was not a good speller. And hence, as he's copying this, you're going to be paying much more attention on the front end. Anytime you do something like this, you're going to be wanting to be perfect on the front end. So he may very well have been looking at the document, wanting to make sure he got every word spelled correctly the way Clayton wrote it out originally. Then he gets to the last 11 verses and he's sort of working from either it's possible that somebody dictated the rest to him. Hey, this is taking too long. Would you mind just reading this to me so I can write it down while you're doing that? And then at the moment, and at the moment he decides that he's going to pay just a little less attention, he's now going to spell destroy the way he spells it rather than the way Clayton spelled it in the document.
Well, as the story goes, they were pressuring Kingsbury to copy it faster. Hiram's waiting to take the original to Emma. So if he's in a hurry, it's possible that he might say for somebody to read it and then start copying.
I will say it does point to, I think, an agreement, which is that the person spelling destroyed one way on the front end and the person spelling it the wrong way on the back end is two different brains working on how to spell destroy. Does that make sense? Kingsbury's letting Clayton do the thinking on the front end, and Kingsbury's doing the thinking on the spelling on the back end. There's two different spellers in the document.
Well, one comeback might be there should be more misspellings. If Kingsbury is doing it by dictation, you might expect more misspellings rather than just this one word.
Yeah. But if you're a bad speller, you generally look up to see where you spelled it the last time. And if he was more subconscious the first time he did it, he might have referred to the previous time of spelling it the next time he uses that word. And now he sees for what he thinks is Clayton's spelling, but it's his own.
Who knows who if there is a second scribe, who the second scribe is. But
Kingsbury tells us that Clayton was the scribe for the entire D&C 132 original manuscript, correct? We get that. We get the assumption that Clayton wrote the entire thing out by his own hand by Kingsbury. Even if you want to suggest those 11 verses were written by a different scribe, the Nauvoo expositor stands as a second witness that it was contemporary to the time that this section was written. Claimed to be written by Clayton. Even if it's not Clayton that's writing it, it's not a late edition. It's testified of by Jane and William Law in the Nauvoo expositor.
So in response to Bill and Dan around the word destroyed, we also have the misspelling of the word servant. Now, Clayton can correctly spell servant 28 times out of 30 in his journal. The misspelling of servant shows up 2 times in 1845. He never goes back and forth between the correct spelling and the incorrect spelling. So why is this important? Well, in the very beginning of Dean C 132 in Kingsbury's copy, verse 1, we have 3 misspellings of the word servant, followed by 1 correct spelling of servant. Then we have 2 incorrect spellings, followed by 1 correct spelling. Then 4 incorrect spellings, followed by 2 correct spellings. Then it's misspelled 5 times, correctly spelled 1 time, misspelled 1 time, correctly spelled 1 time. It goes back and forth 5 times with 15 misspellings, 6 correct spellings of the word servant. So it's important to note that the variation in spelling of servant also shows up with the consistent spelling of destroyed correctly and the consistent misspelling of the word destroyed. So why is the word destroyed misspelled repeatedly while servant goes back and forth between spelling at this point in time? We have to ask, why is servant misspelled 3 times in a row at the very beginning of the Revelation when Bill Real mentions that's when concentration, that's when Kingsbury is the most focused? If Kingsbury is following the copy that he's given, as Dan mentions, that Kingsbury is someone who just copies and doesn't correct spelling, why does this error exist? We have to acknowledge that there's 2 scribes from beginning to end. There isn't a second scribe at just the end. Clayton writes a line, the second person writes some lines, and it goes back and forth. What about the possibility of Joseph Smith or Hiram being the person who writes this in? If Joseph Smith is dictating, then this whole document would be consistent with Clayton's spelling. If we go to Kingsbury's court testimony, we see that Kingsbury is specific when he's swearing under oath that it was only Clayton's handwriting on this document. He himself is the sole copyist. There's no one else in the room with him. So we understand that Kingsbury left Nauvoo at the end of July and doesn't get back until after Joseph Smith is murdered. I think more likely that this document is created while Joseph Smith is alive, anticipating his death to reveal it. Point 3, I like to bring up 2 letters. The first letter is from John Taylor to his wife, and the second letter is to Porter Rockwell. Both of these letters were sent from the Hamilton Hotel when Joseph was waiting to post bail. The first letter from John Taylor is sent between 2-3 o'clock, as well as the letter to Porter Rockwell. John Taylor's letter to his wife tells her to print and bind 1,000 copies of the Doctrine and Covenants, something that he should be able to do if he's planning to go back to Nauvoo later that day after they're posting bail. The fact that John Taylor expects to stay longer shows that he knows that Joseph Smith would be imprisoned, to be taken to Carthage jail, and would be murdered, something that those conspiring to kill Joseph would be aware of. The letter to Porter Rockwell that is said to be from Joseph Smith tells Porter Rockwell not to come to Carthage because there would be possibility that Porter Rockwell would be imprisoned or taken to jail or fall into the hands of his enemies. If you're Joseph Smith at 3 p.m. on June 25th, 1844, there's no reason to believe you are going to jail. You're posting bail and you're going back to Nauvoo. So the person who sent this letter to Porter Rockwell under the guise of being from Joseph Smith did not want Porter Rockwell to guard Joseph and protect his life from being murdered. This is why I'm suggesting that John Taylor or Willard Richards wrote this letter and sent it to Porter Rockwell to discourage him from coming to protect Joseph. So now to Dan's response.
Clark apparently missed the 2 postscripts on the back. The first postscript was added at 2 o'clock p.m., an hour before Joseph Smith found out the governor's plan. The second postscript was added at 3 o'clock p.m. and reads similar to Joseph Smith's postscript to Emma. So when Taylor wrote the body of the letter on the front, which is the part that Clark quotes, he didn't know when he would return to Nauvoo. Joseph Smith's letter to Emma gives the reason for why Joseph Smith would call off Rockwell. Rockwell received a letter from Joseph Smith because he was the most likely person to want to come to his aid, but he wasn't needed. Rockwell said the letter was from Joseph Smith, but Clark knows better than Rockwell.
So in Dan's response, we see that to John Taylor's letter, he says that, well, Clark reads from the 2 p.m. John Taylor where he wants help from his wife because John Taylor doesn't know that he'll be going home later that day. And so he points to the postscript at 3 p.m. where John Taylor mentions, hey, we're going to be escorted by Governor Ford back to Nauvoo. So Dan makes the argument basically that this postscript overrides what John Taylor wrote earlier. When it comes to Porter Rockwell's letter, he says, well, Joseph didn't need Porter Rockwell there because he was coming back home. And that's the reason why the letter was sent in the first place. Our rebuttal to Dan is that posting bail doesn't take several days to do. It's a one-day process. And from Willard Richards' own journal, we see that by 5 p.m., many of the men that had posted bail were already heading back to Nauvoo without Governor Ford's escort. Governor Ford's offering his escort only provided the answer of how, not when, Joseph and John Taylor could return back to Nauvoo. Ford's escort clearly wasn't used for all these men that were already going back after posting bail that Willard Richards mentions. When it comes to the Rockwell letter, Joseph would have, again, no reason to mention the possibility of being imprisoned. If Joseph Smith intended to get across to Rockwell that, hey, I don't need you to come to Carthage because I'm on my way home, he would have said so. But in this letter, it mentions the possibility of imprisonment, which is not on Joseph Smith's mind. For point 4, I argued that Willard Richards and the mob were colluding with each other. I showed the graph where Willard Richards is at the window with Joseph Smith and the mob there at the head of the stairs, as no one was near the door. I argued that when the mob had a perfect shot to shoot at Willard Richards, when they had all the time in the world to do so, they chose not to. I also argued at that time that Willard Richards threatened Joseph Smith to the window with his cane and fractured his skull. I no longer believe the skull fracture came from Willard Richards right now, but I believe a gun was used instead to intimidate Joseph Smith to the window. Also differ on my previous position that Joseph Smith was not shot prior to falling out and being placed at the well. So let me go ahead and share Dan's response, and then I'll share my update and my rebuttal to Dan.
And if you already have a mob coming in with guns willing to fire shots, why not just let them kill Joseph anyway? Like you said, put him in the jail cell, let the mob come in, let them kill him, and you don't even need church leaders to do the murder.
What is the mob doing at the head of the stairs as Richards is standing behind Joseph, as Joseph is hanging onto the window? Why didn't they shoot Richards or Joseph? According to Richards, the mob shot Joseph from the door, forcing him to the window. The mob may have been reloading or exchanging guns or possibly shooting at John Taylor under the bed. Richards was near the window, but to one side, obviously. Richards wasn't a target because, being short and portly, he obviously wasn't one of the Smiths. Willard Richards' account in the Times and Seasons has him going out head first. Joseph, quote, Joseph attempted as a last resort to leap the window when 2 balls pierced him from the door and one entered his right breast from without, and he fell outward, exclaiming, O Lord my God. As his feet went out the window, my head went in, the balls whistling all around. If Joseph wasn't shot yet, as Clark thinks, there is no way Willard Richards could forcefully push Joseph Smith out the window if he didn't want to go, especially sideways. We have a ridiculous scenario where Richards supposedly has a gun. Remember, Clark has argued that Willard Richards kept his coat on in the hot weather to conceal a gun, but he doesn't use it. Instead, he would rather push Joseph Smith out the window.
I'm trying to imagine a grown man who's a little larger than average trying to get out of that window. Number one, they do use the word leap, but that's impossible. Can you imagine a grown man running to that window and trying to jump out of it? And number two, you'd hit your head on the sill. I mean, it would just be near impossible. Plus, recognize he's making the claim, again, go back to the picture, he's making the claim that the window is open. Do we know if the window is open?
I think they opened the windows because of the hot weather.
Okay, so the window's open, so you can't jump through a half a window. This is, in other words, imagine the window's half open, you're not breaking the top of it. You can't run and leap through just the bottom half of that'd be like a circus trick. And so as you point out, the more likely, even though they use the word leap, the more likely explanation is that you're crawling through the window. You don't really fit well. This is not an easy task. You have to sort of contort your body and get yourself out of the window. And it also makes sense with the window being so small that you take a couple of bullet shots, you're injured very badly. You can see how a big person would sort of get stuck half in and half out. And eventually, as you point out, lose consciousness, weight rolls to one side, and out the window you go. You're going to do what all of us would generally do. None of us are going to do a cannonball, sort of make ourselves into a spear and jump through that 2 foot by 2 foot window. Instead, we're going to try to climb out the window, hold on to the sill, and drop down to our feet.
To the shortest distance.
That makes a whole lot more sense.
That's what he's trying to do while these people are shooting at him.
Yeah.
And then he gets hit from inside and outside, like Willard Richards said, and collapses on the windowsill briefly. A Colonel M.B. Darnell testified, "It seems to me Joseph came out head first and he was shot while passing through the window. And while he's hanging, nobody shoots."
Yeah.
That's the point. It doesn't mean they don't shoot at him when he's in the window, but while he's hanging there, like teetering,
everybody's watching the climax of the moment. I mean, it's
right. And
he's injured and he's hanging on for dear life, and he rolls out and falls. I mean, everybody sort of is just going to gasp at that.
So in Dan and Bill's response, they mention, why didn't Willa Richards and John Taylor just allow the mob to kill Joseph Smith and Hiram? And so my new position is that Willa Richards and John Taylor were there to threaten Hiram and Joseph at gunpoint to the window, but they ran into issues with Joseph leaving the room, expecting the Nauvoo Legion to rescue him, which is mentioned by claimed sheriff that was at Carthage jail the day of the murders, which is also mentioned by Alan Stout that Joseph requested the Nauvoo Legion to rescue him. So with Joseph out of the room, they threaten Hiram to the window. And we have Hiram's body where he is dead with his head 2 feet from the northeast corner of that room. So I believe that Willa Richards and John Taylor shot at Hiram. The shot under the chin came from John Taylor as he fell from being shot in the thigh by Hiram. And the shot to Hiram's back came from Willa Richards because that shot is straightforward. My prior thought was maybe someone stood above Hiram with 1 foot on either side of Hiram, shooting downwards as Hiram was laying on his stomach, or that straight shot in his back because it goes into his lower back, straightforward, shattering the pocket watch and Hiram's vest pocket. It makes more sense that Hiram was standing up and that shot came from someone who was straightforward shooting at him. So I think Willa Richards was probably the person that shot Hiram in the back. So then we get to the window. I think Dan's argument that the mob didn't shoot Willa Richards because they were busy reloading or they were busy shooting at John Taylor because apparently John Taylor was a bigger target than Richards, who was standing directly before them, not under any kind of cover like a bed, is foolish. It makes no sense for the mob not to shoot Willa Richards. I believe the mob was working with Richards and John Taylor. I think all of John Taylor's wounds came from Hiram and Joseph. Let me go ahead and mention that Dan argues that Joseph crawled out of the window. We both agree that he crawled out. And he crawled out sideways as the witnesses testify. And so Dan argues that Joseph struggled at the window, having been shot and bleeding, and from blood loss and everything going on, Joseph probably fainted, hung in that window for a few seconds as witnesses testify, and then fell out of that window. And we know that the upper glass of that window is still intact as witnesses testify of seeing bullet holes through the glass. Dan mentions a M.B. Darnell, but leaves out an important part of his testimony. And this is what Darnell said. I remember to have seen Joseph jump from the window. It was a terribly exciting time and it all happened in an instant. I cannot describe it in any better way than by saying he came out just as though someone big and powerful had thrown him right through the window. Undoubtedly, however, he came by his own effort. He certainly did not hang to the window. From Darnell's point of view, he thinks that Joseph threw himself out of the window by his own effort. He's trying to rationalize this. But I think Dan and Bill make a good point. If Joseph is bleeding out. He's a super big guy. He's 6 feet tall. He's in a small 2 foot window. He is not throwing himself out like someone big and powerful. Dan argues that Joseph kind of fell out, like limping over, and his body weight pushed him out of the window. But this witness here that Dan partially quotes says it looked like someone basically threw Joseph out of that window or pushed him. I believe Willa Richards did, in fact, push Joseph Smith. I think this is what happens. I think the point of Willa Richards and John Taylor being there is to push Joseph and Hiram out of that window. They weren't successful with Hiram, but they were with Joseph. I think Willa Richards or John Taylor, or both of them, did fire into Joseph Smith. And then the mob at the well probably shot one time. I no longer hold that William Daniels is correct that all 4 shots came at the well. I think it would be an unusual position to shoot Joseph in the thigh while he's slumped over a well. That position in that thigh shot seems more likely to be when Joseph is standing up rather than at the well. For point 5, I argue Willa Richards and John Taylor were involved in Joseph Smith and Hiram's murders at Carthage jail, and that they had talked Joseph Smith into running for president so that Brigham and them would have an alibi and have reason and to get others out of town. So let's go ahead and hear Dan's counter argument to that.
Taylor and Richards had daily access to Joseph and Hiram. So instead of simply hiring one guy to shoot Joseph and Hiram, or shoot him or themselves by ambush, or poisoning him like they supposedly did others, they decided it would be better to manipulate Joseph Smith into running for president, destroying the press, committing treason, while at the same time conspiring with Governor Ford, the anti-Mormons, the jailer, the deputies, the mob. First, let's get Joseph Smith to run for president so the 12 can control logistics and be sent out of town. Now, those controlling logistics would want to be near Nauvoo, not far away, where they had no control over anything. What if Joseph Smith said, "That's a crazy idea. I don't want to run for president. There's no alibi for conspiracy to commit murder. So there's no advantage, only disadvantage for being 1,200 miles away." If they wanted to assassinate Joseph Smith, there were less elaborate ways of doing it that wouldn't involve so many people and so many things to go wrong.
Well, something you have to understand is that Brigham and them are trying to succeed the church. And to succeed the church, if everyone is there and there's common consent, they would have to kill Joseph and Hiram. They would have to kill Samuel Smith as well and William Smith, because all of them are threats to succession of Brigham Young to leadership. Why is that? Well, Joseph made Hiram co-president. As co-president, he would succeed Joseph if Joseph died. But since Joseph and Hiram both died, the next person to succeed was Samuel Smith. And according to William Clayton's journal, Joseph said Samuel was next to lead. So after Samuel, you would have William Smith, the last brother of Joseph. In the situation that played out, William Smith was still in New York as he was running a newspaper for Joseph's presidency. So what do you think is more logical? That the 12 apostles and them don't leave town? They all are in Nauvoo when Joseph, Hiram, Samuel, and William all die on the same day with no witnesses. None of them survive, and no one suspects Brigham and them of trying to take leadership when Brigham comes up and says, "I'm to lead the church," when common consent kicks in like a day or two or so after all 4 brothers are killed. Or that there's careful planning. If you believe 132 is done in July, before Kingsbury leaves Nauvoo to go on a missions trip, if you believe 132 is part of Premeditation, then they have at least 11 months and they can leave Nauvoo. They have people in place to help guide Joseph. Again, what do you think's more logical? Kill all 4 brothers in a day and none of them survive, no witnesses, and you take leadership of the church? Or you kill 2 of the brothers on the same day. A month later, you kill Samuel, and then William Smith, you don't have to kill because he's out of Nauvoo.
Clark then says, in return, Governor Ford and anti-Mormons will allow weapons into the jail so Taylor and Richards could be armed. Governor Ford had nothing to do with the jail, and anti-Mormons would be the jailer and his deputies, who Clark believes became co-conspirators by allowing Taylor and Richards to have guns. There's not one shred of evidence that Richards and Taylor were armed. Without this highly unlikely conspiracy between the jailer and his deputies and Taylor and Richards, Clark's theory could not have happened. Clark also says Governor Ford would then help protect the counterfeiting in Nauvoo that Joseph was trying to shut down. Nonsense. Why would Ford be involved in Nauvoo counterfeiting?
So in Dan's clip, we see he argues against Governor Ford being involved in conspiring to kill Joseph and Hiram and involved in protecting Brigham and them from counterfeiting charges in Nauvoo. He also argues that the Robert F. Smith, the captain of the Carthage Grays and justice of the peace, was not involved in conspiring against Joseph and Hiram. And he mentions the jailer in there. I don't believe the jailer was involved. That's not part of my argument. The jailer was just following orders from the Justice of the Peace. But let me go ahead and explain why I believe Governor Ford and the Justice of the Peace were against Joseph. So Robert F. Smith was in the anti-Mormon party. He issued a Midas right, a commitment to prison for Joseph Smith, which was illegal since it had not been mentioned to Joseph the charge of treason at his preliminary hearing. When Joseph and his lawyer brought this up to Governor Ford's attention, the governor did not intervene. But we'll see from this Joseph Smith papers here that Governor Ford did intervene for Brigham Young when the counterfeiting charges were brought up against him. Governor Ford was protecting Brigham Young, but when it comes to Joseph Smith, he did not protect Joseph. So Governor Ford and Robert F. Smith ignored due process, which is the right to be informed of the nature and cause of the accusations against the individual, and the right to a hearing where they can be informed of the charges against them, present their defense, and challenge the evidence. The Justice of the Peace, Robert F. Smith, who committed this illegal act, was put in charge of security of Carthage jail. Governor Ford was overheard by Porter Rockwell saying the deed is done by now, referring to the killing of Joseph and Hiram on the day of the murder. So that is a good reason to believe they were involved. Now, what does Governor Ford say about searching the men for weapons? He says, they were not my prisoners, but were the prisoners of the constable and the jailer, under the direction of the Justice of the Peace. So Dan ignores the possibility that the Justice of the Peace and Governor Ford would allow Richards and Taylor to bring weapons into the jail. Governor Ford did not search them for weapons, and the Justice of the Peace, I'm arguing, did not search them for weapons either. Going back to the counterfeiting charges against Brigham Young really quickly. Brigham Young used a body double to prevent himself from being arrested by the federal marshals. Now, Dan Vogel mocks the idea of body doubles being used when it comes to Martha Brotherton, but we have to acknowledge the body double was used in this case. Again, Dan, consider the possibility that Brigham is using body doubles in other ways than just this. For point 6, I argue that Brigham Young knew about Joseph and Hiram's murders in advance, that he sent a letter to his wife on July 8, 1844, telling her that he would start making his way back home in 3 to 4 weeks, with a month and a half left still of the campaign for Joseph Smith's presidency, with it ending on September 7th to the 15th in Washington, D.C. I also point to a letter that Brigham sent to Willard Richards on July 8th, the same day. His letter to Richards, where he's saying, we will do all that we can do, contradicts his letter to his wife saying that I'm coming home early. So let me go ahead and play Dan's response, and then I'll share my rebuttal.
Prior to the 12 leaving Nauvoo, a conference was held in Nauvoo. At this time, Brigham Young explained, those elders who are to preside over the different states will appoint conferences in all places in their several states where opportunities present, and will attend all the conferences or send experienced and able elders. And the 12 will devote the season to traveling and will attend as many conferences as possible. Clark assumes Brigham Young had promised to be in Washington, D.C. in September 1844, but that's not the case. The 12 divided up. We don't know who got what assignments, but Brigham Young was planning to leave in 3 to 4 weeks before the 29th of July. We can assume he wasn't assigned to those locations. Clark says, quotes Brigham Young's letter, July 8th, 1844, to Willard Richards. What do we think Brigham Young says about Joseph Smith winning? the presidency. And well, you know all about that. He says, "We shall do all we can," Brigham continued. "We shall attend the conferences in this country and then leave for the western states and attend meetings and get home quickly." This doesn't sound like Brigham Young was planning to attend the week-long conference in Washington, D.C. in September. He tells Richards, "We shall do all we can," that is, where Clark stopped. But Brigham Young goes on to state, "and shall and leave the event to God with God. The God of heaven will do just as he pleases about it. Whether Joseph Smith wins or loses is in God's hands," showing Brigham Young believes Joseph Smith will be alive when the election is over. Brigham Young's comment about the campaign shows he knows Joseph Smith's election was unlikely, but he is following the prophet and leaving the result in God's hands. Clark suggests that when he wrote his wife on the 8th of July, the day before he learned about Joseph Smith's death, he already knew when he would be heading home. So not only does Brigham Young have to know about the assassination plot before he leaves Nauvoo on the 21st of May, 1844, but the timing of it as well. When Brigham Young left Nauvoo, the expositor hadn't even been published yet, which set in motion the events that would lead to Joseph Smith's arrest and death. But none of that was inevitable.
In Dan's response, he brings up that Brigham would need to know about the destruction of the Nauvoo expositor and the plans that led up to Joseph's murder. Well, something that's interesting is that the letter to Wheeler Richards on July 8th mentions that Brigham has knowledge of the destruction of the Nauvoo expositor. He mentions that he's happy that it was destroyed. Brigham also says it gives us a good chance to speak upon such subject. Why is Brigham interested in the Nauvoo expositor's publication of D&C 132? Why is he interested in this revelation that Joseph did not author? That the expositor was a tool to share the polygamy revelation that they want to attribute to Joseph. I also find it interesting that the same day that we are made aware that Brigham knows about the destruction of the press, he makes plans to return home early. My question to Dan would be, why didn't Brigham make plans before his knowledge of the press being destroyed? Why is it only after that we see he tells his wife his plans to come home early? Additionally, Dan reads many comments from Brigham Young saying we will do all that we can do in his letter to Wheeler Richards and in the General Conference. Brigham only attended about 2 conventions, if I'm not mistaken, by the time this letter was written on July 8th. If you're Brigham Young and you are manager over the entire campaign logistically, as you are head over the 12th, the traveling high council, and it is your duty to oversee it all, wouldn't you be there for the grand finale, September 7th to the 15th? It makes sense for that to be a huge party for Joseph's campaign. But Brigham leaves a month and a half early. I also find it that Brigham's timing shouldn't be ignored. Brigham was only off by a few days from his original plan to come home early. I find that unbelievable that it was happenstance. So let me bring this all together. I believe I have shown that William Law and the Higbees and others published a revelation that was in fact not from Joseph and that was not shared by Hiram to them. And it is interesting that Higbee was responsible for the treason charge that got Joseph to Carthage jail. Robert F. Smith, who did an illegal action to imprison Joseph and was in charge of security, put Joseph in that jail. And John Taylor has knowledge that Joseph would be going to jail before others do. I believe we can see that 3 parties here were definitely involved in conspiring together. So in conclusion, Dan, Bill, others, I believe we can change your mind. Dan, we really need a historian that will take up the mantle to take this farther than any of us can. You've been defending your legacy for years, and I want to encourage you to start a new legacy, looking deeper into these things that could challenge the narrative and break new ground. This movement, this search for truth, we need a historian to jump on board. We need somebody that can help take this further. Dan, I hope you are that person. For all those watching, thank you for your time. I hope we can see more in the future.